Welcome to the Cities of Migration Learning Exchange. Today's webinar explores the topic in the classroom and beyond, supporting refugee students. Education has the potential to be a healing and empowering process for refugee children and youth. But are we taking this important educational and integration opportunity for granted? New research in Canada has found significant gaps in research policy and teacher preparation when it comes to supporting refugee students in Canadian classrooms. This morning, we'll learn about the experiences of refugee students in and beyond the Canadian classroom, current educational policy gaps and opportunities, and successful strategies that we can use to ease the transition of refugee students in our schools. We are joined today by leaders in the field. I'm delighted to welcome our guests from St. Catharines, Canada. We're joined by Snezana Ratovic, Research Officer and Instructor with the Faculty of Education at Brock University. And joining us from Thessaly, Greece, we have Dr. Stavroula Kaldi, Professor with the Department of Primary Education, University of Thessaly. So I'm delighted now to introduce our first guest speaker. Snezana Ratkovic is Research Officer and Instructor in the Faculty of Education at Brock University. She arrived in Canada in 1998 as a refugee woman teacher from the former Yugoslavia. Dr. Ratovic is an award-winning scholar and a recipient of the Brock University Faculty of Graduate Studies 2018 Marilyn Rose Graduate Leadership Award for contributing vision and leadership to the graduate studies community. Congratulations, Snezana. Her research interest lies in migration and indigeneity, transnational and intransdisciplinary teacher education, decolonizing methodologies, and knowledge mobilization. Welcome, Snezana. The podium is yours.
Thank you. Welcome all. Today I will speak to you on behalf of our research team that involves also Claire Ellis, Dragana Kovacevic, Courtney Brewer, Nilofar Ahmed, and Janelle Brady. It is important to talk about refugee students and in the classroom and beyond. And as you might know, the number of refugees, asylum seekers, and internationally displaced people around the world has topped 65 million in 2016. In 2015, more than half of the world's refugees were children. Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia accounted for more than half of the refugees under the United Nations mandate, and 86% of these refugees are hosted in developing countries. This is the global context we live in. What is happening in the Canadian context? Between January 2015 and July 2017, over 84,000 refugees resettled to Canada, including 43% of youth under the age of 17. However, teachers are saying that they don't know how to respond to refugee children. And we have some evidence that school systems across the country lack policy guidance. How we came to explore this topic of supporting refugee students in Canada, of course, because of the current situation and this demand to support huge amounts of refugee students entering Canada. We conducted a scoping review of Canadian literature and education policy in the last 20 years to explore the extent, range, and nature of research activity in the field of refugee students' education, resettlement, and well-being in Canada. Also to identify gaps in the existing literature and policy, determine the value of undertaking a full systematic review, and discuss implications for future research, practice, and policy. To do that, we posed some important questions. How do refugee students experience transition to the Canadian K-12 education system? And just to maybe explain this for some of our international colleagues, K-12 education system includes elementary and secondary education from kindergarten to grade 12. How do teachers educate and support refugee students in their schools? How do education policies guide and support refugee students' education, resettlement, and well-being? And of course, how do resettlement agencies support refugee students' education, resettlement, and well-being? Because we do live in an interconnected world globally and locally. Again, I would like just to highlight one more time that education can be a healing process for refugee and war-affected children. And this was our main inspiration to ask these questions and to answer them, to make sure that we really assist refugee students in healing, learning, and well-being. In terms of the key finding or key messages, we found that there are gaps in Canadian refugee education literature and policy, that refugee students continue to experience socio-psychological challenges in the Canadian classroom, and that definite approaches are challenging, and asset-based approaches to refugee student education can enhance Canadian educational systems. Again, well-being of a child and focus on a child is an important focus in practice and policy. Another thing just to mention is that literature focuses on English language learners, immigrants, and aggregated participants groups rather than refugee students themselves. And we analyzed 59 sources in last 20 years, and only 23 of those sources were related to refugee students. So some of the findings are really speaking to gaps in the literature. There are limited research studies focusing on refugee student education and the strategies teachers, policymakers, and the communities utilize to smoothen the refugee student transition to Canadian schools. There are also not enough studies focusing on refugee student strategies to learn, belong, and succeed. There are limited interprovincial curriculum and policy dialogue and consultation. As you know, in Canada, education is provincially organized, so there are some issues there as well in terms of collaboration and dialogue. There are limited Canadian sources informing Canadian educational policy, which means that many policies that we actually have here in Canada refer to sources from other countries, for example, Australia. And there is limited knowledge about transnational research and collaboration. So what is happening globally in this field and in this area? And again, what is important, we wanted to find out what works in the classroom. And although there was not a lot of literature, that's why we tried to explore more than refugee student-focused literature. So what would work for English language learners sometimes can work for refugee students, but refugee students are not only English language learners. There is more to their experience. So what we did find out in this limited literature is that what works in the classroom is fostering intensive language and differentiated instruction, facilitating multicultural story share, sharing stories, cultures, experiences, and valuing them for all students, setting high expectations for all students. This sometimes seems challenging for teachers because, there is a big question, can refugee students really catch up with Canadian-born students. But if we don't expect from these students, we are not helping them. Expecting less means achieving less for those students. Communicating verbal, clear, and consistent expectations is critical. And using creative arts, which encourage respectful connections among students as well as between the students and the teacher. Because, using creative arts means going beyond the language, expressing and using different knowledges, embodied knowledges and artistic expressions. Also, developing collaborative multi-level approaches based on trust, community, and mutuality. Implementing school-based prevention programs, which are alternatives to health services often underused by refugee youth. These programs are really critical, and they are developed in some of Canadian provinces. Generating timely knowledge and sustainable teaching practice through proactive research and instruction can also help. What we found in our research actually was that some sources or articles or research was done only when some big waves of refugees would come to Canada. So our reaction as scholars and researchers was reactive rather than proactive. So, for example, several articles were published after the wave of refugees coming from the former Yugoslavia in middle 90s, some after 9/11 incident, and then some now, with Syrian refugees coming to Canada. We also looked at the policy because we do know that we have to focus on praxis, which means theory, practice, and policy, because that's what is missing. The policies and guides are missing for educators. So what we found to be promising policies is that provinces that provide an asset-based approach and distinguish between immigrants and refugees have more relevant policies and guides for educators. So when we say an asset-based approach, it means that we don't look at refugee students as problems in the classroom. We don't look only at their language barriers or disrupted education in the past, but we look also at their talents, their resilience, their strengths. Also focusing on refugees rather than putting them together in big aggregated groups with immigrants, asylum seekers, and so on is important because they are similar but different experiences within those groups. Partnerships between policymakers, educators, and community services are emerging across Canada, and that's wonderful because we can do this together. Teachers are not the people who can do this healing education on their own. We all have to be part of this exciting and important endeavor. Some provinces are sharing resources and research findings, what is wonderful as well, because we can learn from each other. So what are the recommendations for educators? First of all, educators must ask themselves the following questions before making any decisions. Who benefits and who is disadvantaged? Who is included and who is excluded? Who is privileged and who is marginalized? Who is legitimated and who is devalued? To whom are we listening and who are we not hearing? What data are we using for our decision making? We have to engage deeply on a personal level with refugee students. We need a deep professional development, ongoing professional development. Developing an asset-based approach to refugee student education is critical. Thinking about refugee students' talents and opportunities. Fostering an inclusive, anti-racist, and pro-diversity education. challenging white supremacy and othering, working with resettlement agencies and programs for refugee families. So thinking about refugee students not only as students or individuals, but as part of a family, working with their families as well. Fostering bilingual education, um, or providing refugee students with some communication in their mother tongue as well. Scaffolding students' learning step by step, implementing differentiated instruction, and nurturing artistic expression, celebrating their knowledge and ways of knowing. Tutoring is also helpful. Sometimes refugee students might need more assistance. Providing extracurricular activities is also important. Creating flexible schedules, providing childcare. That could also be important for youth, refugee youth. Learning from refugee student parents, learning from and with refugee teachers and their pedagogies, conducting longitudinal action research and comparative studies, adopting a holistic, cross-cultural, and multi-sector approach. And what are recommendations for policy and policymakers? Mobilizing policies and resources across provinces and territories. Let's learn from each other. Exchanging policies across national borders. Providing training for all stakeholders in education. This is crucial. Creating and supporting resettlement programs for refugee families. Supporting existing and developing new cross-sector partnerships, which means that there are some partnerships already in place, but they could be developed further and new partnerships should be initiated, supported, and sustained. Mobilizing refugee teachers and their pedagogies. They can be not only cultural brokers with the refugee students and their families, but also they can be role models for them. And of course, funding refugee education research and funding refugee education resources as well. Trickling down policies and resources from federal to provincial and territorial levels. It is not enough to have a federal policy that is not actually implemented on provincial and territorial levels. We have to synchronize those policies and activities. Providing online open access to policy documents across provinces is important. And posting readable text, accessible, readable, and tagging existing documents properly, because sometimes when educators or policymakers are looking for some documents, it is hard to find it, and that was our experience during our research. Also, housing policy documents in a repository. Saskatchewan did a great job in that way, and also providing education policies and community resources. So Manitoba did a great job in terms of providing not only education policies for their educators and guidelines, but also community resources, where to go, how to connect, who might be the partners in refugee students' education. And that would be all for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Snezhana. That was fantastic. Thank you for sharing that tremendous research and policy insights. Very, very rich set of resources. Your emphasis on an asset-based approach really jumped out at me. The idea that we need to look at refugee talent, resilience, and strengths, and not just the some of the problems that all of us institutionally are addressing in order to meet this challenge. And of course, what we know is, and you've left us with some fantastic questions, a perfect segue to the next segment of today's event. We know the Canadian challenges are not unique. One way, of course, to address those gaps is to explore the methods and experience of educators working with refugee children outside Canada. The question, can the national and transnational exchange of educational policy and practice provide solutions and new approaches to support refugee learners and educators? I think you've already suggested they can, and now I'm just delighted to help us take that a little further by turning the conversation over to our expert interview host, Dr. Stavroula Kaldi from the University of Thessaly in Greece. Stavroula Kaldi is professor in pedagogy and instruction in the Department of Primary Education at the University of Thessaly. She carried out undergraduate studies at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki and postgraduate studies at Sussex University in the UK. She's worked as a teacher in English primary schools and in Greece has extensive experience in teaching and research in higher education. Her research interests include project-based learning, cooperative learning, intercultural education, and teacher professional development. Her research is published in various international journals, conferences, and volumes. So I'm going to hand you over to Stavroula, but for our audience, please note that we will be sending you a rich and informative PowerPoint deck that Stavroula has kindly shared with us that will provide a fuller background to the Greek educational system and its current response to refugee students, and that will also be available for download on our website. So, welcome, Stavroula.
Yes.
Before we begin, I do hope you'll share some brief background and insight about your own experiences with refugee students in Greece. The podium is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kim. Hello to everybody. Good morning for the Canadian and the American audience, and good afternoon for the European and the rest of the world countries audience. Yes, the situation is very similar probably to what Professor Snezana Ratkovic presented. In Greece, for the data we have up to now, we have 62,000 refugees. They are hosted and located in our land. And among them, there are 20,000 children between the age of up to 18 years old. And out of them, 3,150 children are unaccompanied, according to the European news we have. You can see on the left-hand side the map of Greece, where we see that the state, in collaboration with 8 NGOs, is implementing identification, the accommodation, and the reception program in 14 cities in mainland and in 7 Greek islands in refugee accommodation structures or hotspots. They're mainly located to the prefecture of Athens, Attica, which is the capital of Greece. The islands of the Aegean Sea that they're close to Turkey. We can also see in the midland of Greece and northern Greece, where are the borders, and all this due to the fact that many of these refugees are attempting to leave the country, and it's a transit. Greece is a transit somehow for them. So what are the fundamental education targets in Greece according to this government, based on the data we have from 2017? We need to give all refugees the right to education. They have the right to be educated, and we try to facilitate their education with reception centers, and we try to support them psychologically, and I think we follow the integrative approach to schooling. And also there are many educational programs that they try to integrate refugee children in the class, in schools, but we also have many programs in non-typical, in non-formal educational organizations. These are the most, I think, the ones that are mostly implemented in the Greek system. However, there are many challenges in the Greek context. Our education faces, I think, similar challenges to the Canadian context when it comes to the needs of refugee students. For example, our teaching staff are not fully trained in educating refugee children. We have a high student dropout rate because, as I said earlier on, refugee students and their families are often on the move en route through Greece to other European countries or to the United States or to Canada. Educators at the same time are under pressure to deliver difficult tasks in a short amount of time, even though there is, an institution of educational policy in our country. So I would like at this point to ask Professor Snezana Ratkovic about the Canada situation, about the situation in Canada. So Snezana, what do you see as the main challenge in ensuring the needs of refugee children and all whether are met? What are the great inequalities and how can they be addressed?
First of all, you know that we have the Canadian Multiculturalism Act from 1988, and that we talk about ourselves as a multicultural society, and what we are in many ways. But the big challenges are really to negotiate, Canada as colonial country, and we often say that Canada has developed based on immigration, but some of our indigenous colleagues would say that also Canada is based and has developed on the displacement of indigenous people. So we have many cultures, which really, so we don't have two cultures, to negotiate. So there are many cultures to negotiate, and what is happening, the first thing is this deficit approach to refugee student education, because people are really focused on challenges, barriers, what is missing, and so that's one thing. Teachers, resettlement officers, and policymakers often lack cross-cultural competencies. So although we live in a multicultural society and we have policies and acts, how we implement all those policies is another question. And that's why it is important to do more research and see how are all these policies, and some of them are promising, how are they actually implemented in the classroom or in the society. Also, what is missing, and you might be surprised here when you hear me say that teachers, resettlement officers, and policymakers are also missing a social justice focus, because there are many conversations and dialogues about equity, diversity, and inclusion in Canada in different areas. But is this really happening? That's a big question, because when you think about teachers who are working hard, who have a diverse classroom with students from different cultures, they have immigrants, they have refugees, they have indigenous students, they have also students with challenges, learning challenges. So that's really complex and contested environment, and with limited resources, they have to teach, and they do their best, but then they're pushed actually to focus on standardized testing and the outcomes of those testing. So their focus shifts from one-on-one maybe relationships from students, multicultural dialogues. It shifts on outcomes, on mathematics, on language arts, and so on. So that's a big challenge, and not even enough resources. And according to Brewer and McCabe, teachers and policymakers are more comfortable discussing multiculturalism than critically examining the inequities immigrants and refugees face in the Canadian educational system. So,
Okay. Right, yes. Thank you very much. But I would like to ask a couple more questions.
sure.
Now, I will move on to something more scientific in regards regarding intercultural education. So let me say this. According to the international literature in intercultural education, I have observed that there are three different trends. One is multilingualism, the other one is integration, and the last one is inclusion. There is a lot of discussion recently about inclusion. The multilingual approach stands for the development of multilinguistic skills as a tool for interpersonal communication without any interest on the cultural taking and sharing process of this communication. The inclusive approach stands for the right of each person to be treated at an individual level according to his or her needs. In Greece, the state takes a rather integrative approach to refugee education policy, which embraces people from different backgrounds, having dual or more identities, but eventually become part of the development of a possibly unified society. Now, we know that Canada's multicultural policies are well known. So I would like to ask you, where do you think that Canada stands in terms of intercultural education, and where can improvements be made?
So in terms of, intercultural, there is a call for intercultural or cross-cultural education, and there are some initiatives even here at Brock University. We have a cross-cultural competences workshops that will be offered through our indigenous group and unit. But the curriculum is actually not addressing intercultural education, or teacher professional development programs are not addressing so much at this point. I hope they will be shift to that direction. But we also, I guess, we have a lot of knowledge. We recognize many values, and again, how do we implement them in the classroom? How to move from theory to practice? I think that's a big question, and how to double check what is happening in the classroom, because as you might know, we are still struggling to recognize indigenous knowledges in our educational systems. The knowledges of the people who are indigenous to this land, Turtle Island. And, recently we have published final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Again, there is a report, more work needs to be done. Also, you probably know that there is a big inclusion policy for students with learning challenges or with a disability. And now we open the doors to those students, the classroom doors. But physical inclusion is not enough. It has to be holistic inclusion. And recent report called If Inclusion Means Everyone, Why Not Me? By Reld et al., 2017, they found out that we are failing students with disabilities in Canada. So, we have great knowledge. There are policies emerging, guidelines. We have to work hard on implementing them.
Yeah, thank you. And a last question, Snezana, for today. Education, like immigration, is largely a national policy domain, but inclusion happens at the local level in our local schools, playgrounds, libraries, and parks. What do you think are some good examples of local policies or interventions that accelerate educational outcomes for refugee education, for refugee children?
So I think that there is a shift in policy, and like I can say maybe 5, 6 years ago, the policies about refugee children rarely, the policies, the educational policies rarely included any references to refugee students, and sometimes when they did, they really talked about challenges and barriers and how to deal with refugee students as problems in the classroom. But there is a shift. In 2013, Ontario Ministry of Education uses the following language across the documents. English language learners, but again, not refugee students, but English language learners arrive in Ontario as newcomers from other countries. They may have experience of highly sophisticated educational systems, or they may have come from regions where access to formal schooling was limited. They bring a rich diversity of background knowledge and experience to the classroom. So I see this as a big shift. And some of the provinces also, as I mentioned earlier, have great guidelines, and policies for educators. For example, Ontario and Newfoundland contain the most results related to refugees. And resources included guides for classroom teachers, language teachers, and administrators. Saskatchewan, for example, has this repository that is called Nurturing Resilience, Supporting Refugees. And so that's really wonderful that they are doing this and highlighting this assess, not deficit approach, but assess approach to refugee students and their education. So I think those are some great policies and guidelines that are emerging.
Okay. Thank you very much, Snezana.
You're welcome. Thank you, Stavrola.
Thank you too.
And thank you, Snezana and Stavroula, for sharing your expertise and insights. We've got an incredibly rich set of ideas to work with. So let's move over now we've concluded the formal portion of our webinar, and so let's move over now. It's time for our audience Q&A, where I'm starting to see some great questions coming in now from all over the place. Let's see how many we can get through. I'll just start by saying to Kelly Stevenson, who says, where are these fantastic resources? That a very, very rich bibliography is included in the resources that we're making available for this session, so you'll have plenty to follow up with later. Let's go first to a question from Shi Chao. This is a question for you, Snezana. She asks you to give some examples of the critical arts which you recommended as another strategy for helping refugee students in the classroom.
Oh, sure. So, of course, visual arts, music, drama, play building, different kind of expression, even, digital ways of knowing. So what is possible, craft, many things are possible. And to go beyond the language and actually to enhance language learning. And I'm not sure if I answered that question, if I need to be more specific.
No, I think that's great. I'm going to keep going because lots of questions are coming in. The next question is from David in Genoa, Italy. David would like to know if you have modified some parts of the teacher education curricula in order to prepare new teachers to face the challenges of refugee education, and whether you know of any universities or school systems that have made such changes. So someone looking for assistance in the classroom.
I don't see this happening a lot, and I know that sometimes these kind of events or a professional development is done in terms of workshops rather than courses. And then, so I think that actually development of program with not only one but several courses that could help actually develop cross-cultural competencies, think about diversity, equity, social justice, um, and refugee students' education need to be developed. And we hope with this, starting with this webinar and all the resources and thinking about starting with some workshops for teacher candidates and teachers, of course. It's challenging because, and I did do some workshops in the past, but those workshops would happen once a year. So really we have to focus and we have to connect with policymakers, with universities, with schools, and build relationships to actually make this happen. Because otherwise we are all looking for some important results, but we are not connecting, so we are all missing a lot. So we will try to mobilize the knowledge we just gained, and there are many resources that we developed as a research team. We have a What Works monograph for teachers. We have policy brief for policymakers. We have a final report. It is a little bit longer, so I don't anticipate that everyone will read it. But anyway, and we are sharing these resources with ministries of education and this is school boards. I cannot anticipate their response, but they will be informed and they will get the resources. And we also created 2 videos. One is about refugee students' belonging and well-being, and another one is about refugee students' academic success. And all the resources are available online.
Yeah. That's great, and we'll make sure that those are shared with you. But Stavroula, would you like to comment on that question from David about adapting the educational curricula?
Yes, I would like. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, actually, teacher education curricula are not directly focusing on refugee education in Greece, but we do have in all university pedagogical departments in Greece the course of intercultural education, which incorporates issues of social justice. And we have long discussions, and there is a scientific discourse on issues of social justice for Roma children and for children with an immigrant background. I can understand that refugee education has got differences, but at the same time it is all under the umbrella and the aegis of intercultural education. And I should clarify here for the Greek case that in-service teachers need more to be professionally developed and be educated, be trained on refugee education rather than prospective teachers, because there is this unemployment issue with prospective teachers in Greece. So even if we educate them at the moment, specifically for refugee children, I don't think they will invest onto that directly. So what is needed more for us is to train, I think, in-service teachers in all the challenges of refugee education. I think this must be the priority for the Greek system. But again, I should also mention that in my university, as far as I know, and in this department where I'm located, there are informal actions that they promote refugee education in non-formal organizations, and some colleagues attempt to embrace refugees in non-formal organizations through different educational actions.
Very good. I have a question here.
May I just
please
add something in terms of Canadian context? Because I know that we have to talk about priorities. We cannot do it all. But I do think as an educator that refugee education in Canada should start in pre-service programs, in teacher education programs, because sometimes some teachers might think, I don't have refugee students, I really don't need to know this. I don't have any refugee students, or maybe I will not have any refugee students in my classroom. But all those strategies that work with refugee students would also work with other marginalized groups, as, for example, indigenous students, students living in poverty, racialized students, and so on.
Very good. We have a lot of questions coming in. I have a question which we're going to take as a technical question from the Omaha public school system in the U.S. Omaha asks when you stated that education should distinguish between immigrants and refugees, could you provide an example or clarify how educators can distinguish? So a short answer, in Canada and in Greece, how do educators distinguish between immigrants and refugees? Snezana?
Immigrants could be economic immigrants. So, with all that, without any trauma, without, financial challenges, and with the refugees, maybe even without schooling disruption. But with the refugees, it's different. So, and in ways how to distinguish, really, if we think about people as individuals, but understanding the complexities of the situation that refugees are coming from, so kind of trying to learn more about each student, but especially about their background and educational and cultural context is important.
And Sarula?
Yes, I think it's more or less the same, even though, yes, they're all, I think, immigrants. Refugees, yes, need more psychological support. In any case, it is a big change in their lives for both types of groups. And I think they all need the psychological support because they change land, they change environment, probably the language is new. Not probably, it is new for them, and they need to adjust to a new environment. At the same time, I think the main difference between the so-called economic immigrants and refugees is this trauma, as Snezana mentioned, about either war or a situation that is really hard for them. And I think that's where we need to pay more attention to the psychological support.
That's a perfect segue to a couple of questions that have come in, Stravula. Perfect. We've got Roxanne Langevin who says, well, how do you support children who may be suffering from trauma? And so perhaps each of you could talk about some specific strategies or policies that you come across to address the issues of trauma in refugee education. There's a second question here on the subject as well, which I'll post momentarily. So what are some strategies for dealing with trauma with refugee children? Maybe we'll go with you first, Rula?
Yes, okay, yes, thank you. Well, I think that's a difficult question, indeed, but there are some structures in Greece from NGOs and the Greek government to facilitate this process. But I'm afraid I cannot really say much about that because we still are working on it. The last 2 years there is a large input of refugees from Syria, from Somalia. We had from Somalia from some years ago. And these are things that we really need to work on more. So I cannot say much on that because we need to develop a lot on that.
Yeah. How about you, Snezana?
First of all, I have to highlight the importance of partnerships. we cannot ask from a teacher in the classroom to do it all. So we need support, we need partnerships with communities, resettlement agencies, professionals, health professionals, families. We really need to know what's going on. Also, I mentioned already prevention-based school programs that use arts as way of learning, teaching, and expressing, and they prove to be useful, and actually being even an alternative to health services that often refugee youth don't use. And why don't they go and use and ask for consultations or counseling because of some stigma that might emerge from that they're not feeling well, and I have to tell you one thing that what I've heard from actually an international student who is here at Brock, when she's participated in a play and play building, she said that this was the first time since she came to Canada that she allowed herself to feel sad and show her sadness and struggle, because she thought that she must be strong. She has to show that she's strong, and this was really a big thing for her. So, those are the things that can work. Also, I want to say that silence is okay. Sometimes if students are silent, that's okay. It can have its value, and I would encourage and invite teachers to challenge their assumptions about refugee students and for example, if there is trauma and the student is not participating, that it doesn't mean necessarily that the student doesn't have the ability to participate, because there might be something else going on.
Yeah. So need to listen and be open. Now, you've already partially answered my next question from the Saskatoon Open Door Society. That person asks you to explain the role of resettlement agencies. So maybe we'll turn to you now, Stavroula, for how schools in Greece work with community agencies to support refugee students.
Yes, they communicate with them, and NGOs attempt to be the translators many times, often for the children. There are structures also, as I said, that they place refugee families, in certain areas where they can attend school. Children can attend school, and there is a good level of communication. They attend the school, people from NGOs, in some cases, to support this communication. And I think what best works is to enhance and expand this communication with local communities, so as to learn about refugees and accept that they have come to live in this country and stay for as long as they want.
Great. Now I have a question now from Fernando Nunez, who talks about the issues. He notes that refugee children at the age of 7 are probably different from those from teenagers of 15. So in your research, did you find differences in effective approaches to refugee children of different ages? So it would be interesting to hear a little bit about that. And then I have another question that I would like you to comment on, and that is, what is the impact of refugee children on the sort of, if you want, mainstream children in the classroom? So first, let's, Snezana, can you comment on approaches, differentiated approaches for elementary and secondary school students, and whether you made any observations in your research about the impact of refugee children on the Canadian classroom?
One thing is that older age at arrival also increases social challenges because younger children, they don't have developed fully their friendship networks and their identities. So they are, it is proved in the literature that they are more likely to adjust to a host environment, make new friends quickly, and with the teenagers, that could be quite difficult.
Yeah.
And there is also, and with all those uh, stories and medias and all these conflicts in the world, when you think about, for example, 9/11 and how that impacted many of Islam groups and communities, or when you think about the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, actually Serbia then Yugoslavia, and you have those students in the classroom with and some refugees whose families are in Yugoslavia, for example, and they are bombed by the United States and Canada and NATO. Um, so it could be on one side be really threatening to a Canadian-born or um, students,
Mm-hmm.
and it can also be really confusing and scary for those refugee students.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's exactly why we need to think about these issues globally
Mm-hmm.
and
Yes.
try and think about peace education, and that's
Mm-hmm.
also one important thing.
Yeah, this human rights-based approach, social justice approach, that's
Yes,
very interesting.
yes.
And
And I just one thing I would
Stravula,
like
yeah.
to say that social justice terminology sometimes scares people.
Yeah.
People are intimidated by that language. But really, thinking about diversity and equity rather than equality. Equality, you give everyone the same, but equity is when you give people what they need. Maybe that's the language we should use um, to respect others and be respected.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. So let's go now to a question from Zipura Askerjan, who wants you to ask you to briefly elaborate on the asset-based education uh, that you've recommended, Nazina, in relation to the teacher's professional development. Please elaborate on this asset-based approach.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. So, that the point is that as it was written in this new policy, the Ministry of Education policy, that refugee students bring talents and strengths. And thinking about one simple thing, often you hear that people are talking about, for example, um, English as a second language. And sometimes people are not so sensitive to language, and I am. And when we talk about English as a second language, we talk about hierarchies. We talk that this person does not speak English well, and there is something insufficient knowledge, and things like that. So I like to call English as an additional language, because in many
Mm-hmm.
cases when you talk about refugee students or even immigrant students, they are already maybe speaking one or two languages, and English is not their second, maybe it's their third or fourth, but actually it is their additional language. And in this way, we recognize that these students have knowledge, some additional knowledge that maybe their peers do in the classroom. So, that's a simple example how we move from deficit approach to an asset approach. Also, it's thinking about resilience, exploring more, how refugee students are resilient and how they go through challenges, and that often they experience bullying because of and lack of trust due to peer and teacher negative attitudes towards refugees. because you know it happens. We are all people, and we all have limited knowledge. So of course we have to learn more. But you know, in these situations, um, we really have to think about the talents they bring and think about leadership. How can they be leaders in the classroom rather than somebody who is always supported? And how they can be leaders in the classroom or maybe also mentors for new refugee students coming in. So things like that.
Hmm. Very good. We have a lot of questions related to English as a second language learning or second language learning in the classroom. Jen Hobson writes, how can ESL instruction of adults support the parents of these children so that it, you know, what kind of research is being done about the refugee parent-child relationship as it pertains to educational success? So what came out of your research, Snezana, about the role of parental support and the parent-school relationship?
Yeah, this is a great question. This is so important because, again, partnerships, connections, making connections, we cannot ask teachers to teach students and ignore what is happening with the parents. So so that's why we actually talked about transformative leadership skills, where educators are not focused only on their classroom, they're focused on the society, how to make society a just society, not only the classroom, so thinking big. And this is also important, you know, to listen to parents, to educate them, because, you know, if they learn English, of course, if they are fluent in English, they will have more opportunities, still limited, but more opportunities to get good employment, to support their children financially. And, you know, sometimes some challenges that refugee students face is a lack of family support due to family stressors because they need to, you know, the parents are busy trying to make living, and then these students must babysit or cook or clean or translate for their parents. So, and they don't often have a lot of help with homework because of that language barrier and parents being overwhelmed with work and uncertainty of, you know, their lives.
No, that it's all part of that holistic approach that I think you've both recommended very highly. I have another. We've gone over time. We'll take a few more questions before we wrap up because they're so interesting.
Before that, Kim, sorry, can I?
Please, please do.
Yes, about the last question, I think for the Greek context is a big challenge, the language aspect, because English for the Greek context is a medium to communicate, for the communication between parents and teachers. We have to think that children who attend the Greek school are learning, refugee children are learning the Greek language. So English is a medium in case they speak English. Because some refugee children from Syria, for example, do not speak English. So it's a big challenge for the Greek teacher how to communicate with his children. And they need to embrace parents as well. And there are programs to support refugee parents to learn Greek in afternoon schools.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. That's great. We have, so I'm just going to move very quickly through two questions. One from Veronica, who is teaching Swedish as a second language to immigrant children in Helsinki in Finland, ages 17 to 16. These students are integrated into normal classrooms one by one, and then they're visited once a week at home. Then they're visited once a week where she's able to help them with the language and their schoolwork. But Veronica is concerned about how well these children continue to be supported at home with refugee parents who may not have the language skills or the luxury of time, etc., to support them. She notes these children often do not have good results at school and don't. The world and and her task, she says, weekly on a weekly basis gets bigger, and she's looking for advice. And in that context, I thought it would be very interesting to share the note from Surrey, BC, where our colleague says, with summer break approaching and considering client confidentiality, he wonders how to work collaboratively with schools around the family literacy program that they run. He'd like to invite refugees from elementary school students who are struggling to participate in some of their small group language learning activities over the summer. So there's one interesting program that can certainly help bridge the home and school, but also that long gap over the summer for young refugee learners. But perhaps both of you would like to weigh in on programs like this in and outside of the classroom to support continuity for learning for refugee children during the gaps of summer, etc.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I really, in many ways, as you already described it, so I won't repeat it.
Mm-hmm.
And we it's time to imagine new ways of supporting refugee students. In our research, we found some things that work and some challenges, but think about being creative, about being passionate. And thank you, Veronica, for being so passionate and wanting to make a difference and looking for more. She has few strategies, but she feels it's not enough. So yes, tutoring is great. Providing extracurricular activities, after school also can be helpful. Thinking about art again, thinking about events that would really invite not only students but parents as well. So we're learning together, and maybe there must be phases. Maybe in first phases we need to translate some documents and information for parents in their language, their mother tongue. But then try to keep working with them and moving forward in many ways. And I know that the funding for English language learners programs has been cut down. Maybe we need to bring that up again, because it's not only we can say that new host country or classroom impacts refugee students' experiences, education, and well-being, but it is true vice versa as well. Canadian classrooms are impacted, and Canadian-born students are impacted. So we must work together to develop strength and well-being for all of us, so to speak. One thing and one strategy, but again, this might not be available for all parents, is also some parents choose to volunteer in schools. So be part of the parent board or consortium or something. They volunteer in organizing some events. But again, if the parents must work and make a living, do they have time and energy to volunteer? But involving parents in those school initiatives and events would help. For sure.
Well, that's interesting. That answers a question from Alexi at KWB Hamburg around whether non-school organizations should be helping to support refugee students. If yes, how? Well, you've answered some of that already. Snezana, do you want to comment, Stavroula?
Yes, yes, I think it's a very, it's a brilliant idea, this collaboration with the non-formal institutions. And I think the opening up and the sharing of ideas and activities from yes, head teachers and teachers, that would be a start. So if we open up our classrooms, our schools to other non-formal institutions and look at the actions they're following, incorporating and refugee families as well, I think that would be a good idea. yes, to open up probably the schools to these non-formal institutions, education institutions. On the other hand, it could be the other way around, where the non-formal institutions could start the communication with schools and present probably some of their actions to school committees and see whether whether they could take it from there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good. We've had such a rich conversation here. I'm going to just read a few more, the last few questions. Jocelyn Hardman, who's a volunteer with Catholic Social Services in Dayton, Ohio. She handles refugee resettlement in Dayton. She says, many of us volunteer as ESL tutors in local schools, but training and educational and cultural outcomes are often learned as we go. Are there resources available for community tutors to identify and monitor student and family needs and learning outcomes? I have another question from Vishnu, who wants to know what peace education is. We have another question from Chiara. She wants to know more about specific classroom projects that have been evaluated that can facilitate inclusion in our classrooms. More questions than we can take at this time, but the exchange that we've had today answers the question of whether there's a value in transnational exchange, in the kind of opportunities we've created today by having our experts online, Stavroula and Snezana. You have given us much to think about. Thank you for sharing your expertise and insight with us. We must think of a way to continue this conversation, perhaps in a later webinar. For now, we've concluded today's presentation. I would like to thank both of you. And to end with one very short question, I like to close by a very short question for each of our two presenters. So in a very few words, what is for you, Snezana, the next important idea that your research is taking on?
You know, the important idea is to mobilize this knowledge that we gained in faculties of education and in these school boards, if possible. We will reach out and we'll see what will happen. And another idea is to actually bring this research to the global level. So collaborate with Stavroula and collaborate with some other colleagues who show their interest. And there are some colleagues from New Zealand, Australia, Turkey, Germany. So, yeah, there are people interested in moving forward and learning more together.
Yeah, it's very exciting. The global classroom learning community. And how about, and you, Stavroula, what is your next big idea on your research and work agenda?
Well, yes, in terms of refugees and refugee education, I think my main interest and a big agenda would be to see how we can work with these children and teachers can work with these children and how they can collaborate in the classroom and work and adjust to new environments. I think I'm most focused on the instructional strategies, the psychopedagogies that we can use to support these children, support teachers to help these children to adjust to new environments. And
brilliant.
I think this, yes, and I think this, as Snezana mentioned, this global collaboration and see how these instructional strategies, instructional methods, or psychopedagogical approaches can work in different educational contexts for refugee children.
That's wonderful. So how we are the same and what we can share and how we are different. Thank you so very much. Our time has run out. On behalf of all of our participants here at Cities of Migration and the SP Network, let me thank Snezana and Stavrula for a brilliant exchange of ideas. Thank you also to Evelyn Sue, our Learning Exchange Coordinator, and the production team here at Ryerson University. And a special thanks today to Claire Ellis, our Ryerson connection to the SB Network. To our audiences in Cities of Migration everywhere, imagine this exciting research being interpreted in your city, adapted by your organization, or changing the schools in your neighborhood. We'd like to hear more about your stories, more of your stories, and share more of these good practices. So please, everybody, stay connected.